My name is Josh Hicks. I'm with the Wilderness Society. I'm the conservation director at TWS based in Denver, Colorado. The panel that we're going to be going over today, it's going to focus on, well, I'll be the moderator for the panel today, just so you guys know. We're going to have a whole series of panelists. And I want to thank the conference organizers first off for creating the space for this panel. And the panel is going to focus on 3 initiatives that will have impact lands that are managed by the federal government within EPA's Region 10. And these lands are ancestral and current homelands for many of the tribes that are at the conference here. The 3 initiatives that we're going to be going over today are 1, the BLM's public lands rule, which will impact all of the BLM lands across the country. The second is the Forest Service's proposed climate resilience rulemaking, which will impact all of the National Forest System lands across the country. And then thirdly is the Northwest Forest Plan, which will impact all of the many of the national forest lands across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, which I believe is about 20 million plus acres. So these 3 initiatives, needless to say, could have profound implications for lots and lots of lands across the country, including within EPA's Region 10. So I have a couple of questions for each of the panelists to go through, and then after the panel discussion, what we'll do is we'll go through and just kind of have a Q&A from the audience after that. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and just introduce the panelists. So first off, here with me in person is Jamie Barber. Jamie has a BS in botany from Washington State University and a PhD in wood and fiber science from the University of Washington. During that time, he periodically lived and worked on the Macaw Reservation in Washington State, and he spent his early career at the Weyerhaeuser Technology Center and Foreign Tech Canada Corp doing wood products research. Since 1993, he's worked with the USDA Forest Service. The first 20 years were with the Pacific Northwest Research Station, where he managed the social science, economics, ecosystem services, and science delivery research programs, and acted as the assistant director for research from November 2012 from November 2013. His personal research focused on the interaction between resource extraction and ecosystem dynamics at the landscape scale. And then in 2013, he moved to the Forest Service's headquarters, the Washington office, where he served as the senior policy advisor and to the deputy chief of the National Forest System, advising on the agency's inventory, monitoring, and assessment strategy. In August 2017, he became the assistant director for adaptive management, resource information, social sciences, and economics, and ecosystem management and coordination staff. And then since April of 2022, he's led the Forest Service's response to the mature and old growth section of President Biden's executive order, strengthening the nation's forest communities and local economies. Next, I'm going to introduce Christy Tapio Harper. Christy is the U.S. Forest Service's Regional Tribal Relations Specialist for Region 6, which covers Washington and Oregon. Previously, Christy was the Alaska Native Liaison for USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service in Alaska. She's worked in various positions within the federal government spanning 25 years, such as soil conservationist, rain technician, archaeology technician, district archaeologist, regional archaeologist, and tribal liaison. She's also worked with both NRCS and the Forest Service over her federal career. She's received a degree in anthropology and natural resources management from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And when she's not traveling for work, she's in the Colville area. And outside of work, Christy can be found walking through the many rivers of Alaska and now exploring the waters of the Pacific Northwest. Fishing's her passion, as it is the main staple of traditional food for her family. Christy and her husband, Paul, have 2 daughters, Sheila and Sky. Sheila, a recent high school grad, and Sky is just a freshman in high school. Christy and Sky can be found traveling to various soccer tournaments throughout the year. And Paul has another daughter, Shea, whom she has 2 grandkids, Brighton and Camila. Next is Donna Bach. Donna, hi Donna, is the state native liaison and tribal member of the Sag Umut. Traditional Native Council is of Yupik heritage. She was born and raised in Bethel, Alaska, where she's a graduate of Gonzaga University. Her career spans working for the state of Alaska as a fish and wildlife tech public affairs director for Alaska's tribal health system and policy and government relations work for the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation and Calista Corporation, with extensive experience working with rural Alaska communities. She's received an MPA from the University of Alaska's Southeast in 2019 with a concentration on natural resource policy, and is intrigued by the importance of BLM's multiple use mission and its relevance to America and Alaska's economy. Donna is passionate about sharing her knowledge of Alaska Native cultural groups, their land status, and unique land history as it pertains to Anksa and Anilka. Prior to joining the BLM in 2022, she worked with the Department of Commerce, helping promote the 2020 census with Alaska Native groups. Next is Dave Johnson. Dave is the tribal liaison with the BLM in Oregon and Washington State Office. Dave's background is in anthropological archaeology across the United States in historic and prehistoric contexts, as well as historic structure preservation. He holds graduate degrees from Washington State University, specializing in landscape archaeology. A strong interest in how different peoples interact with environmental leads to his continuing interest in working on the ground with Indigenous partners for the benefit of the natural environment. Outside of work, Dave enjoys traveling and pursuing outdoor activities in all seasons and environments, including hiking, mountain biking, fishing, whitewater rafting, and snowboarding and skiing. And then lastly, we have Gordon. Gordon is the Associate State Director for the BLM's Colorado State Office. Gordon is a 17-year BLM veteran. During this time, Gordon has held numerous positions with the BLM headquarters, including Division Chief for the Resources Services, Division Chief for Fish and Wildlife Conservation, Senior Policy Advisor and Assessment for Inventory Monitoring Program Project Manager. Gordon has a PhD in soil science from the University of Idaho. Gordon was raised on a family farm in southern Idaho, not far from here, and continues to enjoy trips back to the farm. He enjoys gardening, camping, entertaining, and introducing his grandchildren to the amazing beauty of our public lands. So we got quite a panel here today. And what we're going to do here is I have a couple of questions for each of the panelists, and we're going to go over those 3 initiatives that I talked about before that are taking place within the Forest Service and the BLM. So first, we're going to go to Gordon. And the first question here, Gordon, is that for each of you guys, but we'll start with Gordon, to take a few minutes to cover each of those agency initiatives that I mentioned before. And for Gordon, for you, it would be the BLM's public lands rule that's underway, including what this rule is, why the agency is undertaking the initiative, why it's important, and if you can, the geographic scope and how it will or won't influence the management of federally managed lands in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Alaska. So basically, what is this rule and why is it important is the question. So take it away, Gordon.
All right. Hey, thank you. And I could talk for the rest of the afternoon about all those questions that you just asked, Josh. So, but I know I only have 5 minutes, and so I have a couple of slides I want to run through quickly, and largely because I want folks to have something that they can refer to after this meeting, because this is important, and it is important that you comment on this as you see fit. So this is the proposed public land rule. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's how you comment. So please come back to this slide after this presentation if you so desire. Next slide. And the important thing there is the comment deadline is June 20th. So the proposed public land rule, it refines the framework for managing our nation's public lands to ensure healthy landscapes, abundant wildlife habitat, clean water, and balanced decision-making. And as I say, as I introduce this rule all the time, I think all of us can agree with this fundamental purpose of the rule. Next slide. This infographic that you see here describes the 3 main components of the rule. So protecting the most intact, healthiest landscapes, restoring landscapes back to health, and ensuring wise decision-making based on science and data. All 3 of those, I think, are very important to our native communities. And I really do think that this rule will help influence the decisions that BLM makes and help restore these lands back to health. Next slide. Just quickly going through what the three components of the rule: protecting intact landscapes. And so this is really all about identifying areas of critical environmental concern, ACECs, how we protect them and how we manage them. Next section of the next slide, and the next piece of the rule is restoring lands and waters. And so this is through conservation leasing, and this is by far the section of the rule that has created the most concern, and yet I think also provides the greatest benefits for the future of our public land. And so it provides that mechanism for durable mitigation and restoration. These leases would not override valid and existing rights, but they would be cooperative agreements between the existing users of the public land and the idea of restoring these public lands to maintain their health and sustain them into future generations. It applies, it establishes a process for establishing these leases, and then also a process for terminating them if they are not being effective. And the third portion of the rule, the next slide, is really about making wise decisions. And this section of the rule, I think, is particularly important to our tribal partners as that it promotes tribal engagement. And it requires the decision makers to have meaningful consultation with tribes and Alaska Native corporations. It provides opportunities to be co-leads or serve as cooperating agencies. It respects and equitably promotes the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. So this is an opportunity that we are taking to encourage tribes to suggest ways in which Indigenous knowledge can be used to inform the development of alternatives, analysis of effects, and when necessary, identification of mitigation measures. And then the next slide is just kind of a summary. Really, the idea of this rule is to give us additional tools for protection, for restoration, and making wise decisions. We want to identify these intact landscapes and develop management plans to protect them. We want to prioritize those areas that are degraded and develop restoration plans for those areas. And we want to act on opportunities for multiple use and sustained yield. So really the bottom line here, and what our organic statute tells us to do, is we want to manage for healthy lands that ensure abundant wildlife habitat, clean water, and balanced decisions. Then the next slide, again, it's just how to comment. Again, the comment deadline is June the 20th. Josh, I think that is a quick summary of what this rule's intent is, and the importance of folks giving comments or providing comments about concerns that they have or changes that they would like to see in the rule. So hopefully I know it's a very brief overview, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the importance and what we're doing here. So that is the end of what I have to present, Josh.
All right, thank you, Gordon. So what we're going to do for some of those who arrived late is we're going to go through and kind of ask the same question to all the different panelists who represent the Forest Service and the BLM, and there's going to be room at the end for some Q&A. So thanks, Gordon. Next up, we're going to hear from Jamie Barber, who's here with me in person, and Jamie's going to go over the Forest Service's proposed rulemaking for climate resilience.
Thank you. And if you haven't heard about this, that on April the 20th, the Forest Service has released an announcement for proposed rulemaking for climate. And what we're trying to do with that is we're trying to think about how our policies need to change in order to adapt to a changing climate. And we really are looking for input from all sources. One thing that I should probably mention is that the official announcement is not out yet, but it will be at the end of the week. And that's that the tribal consultation process for this will be beginning with a tribal forum on the 13th of July, excuse me, the 12th of July. And the consultation period will be a continuous consultation period, so there won't be a limited time to it. And we'll be looking for input from tribes throughout the time that we're working on this AMPR. It has 5 overarching themes to it. The first one is how should we adapt our policies to a changing climate? The second is how should we plan for climate resiliency at various organizational levels? So at the national level, at our Forest Service regional levels, national forests and ranger districts. The third is what kinds of management actions will work. So what do people think are things that we should do? What do people think are things that we shouldn't do? How should we manage? The fourth is how should we manage relationships with tribes, partners, given the cross-jurisdictional impacts of climate? And one thing I want to say here, I've been with the Forest Service for 30 years, and the change in the way that we are trying to interact with tribes is just tremendous. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we really have changed our thinking about this, and we're talking about co-stewardship on a regular basis. We're really trying to figure out how to make that work. And so this is sort of an invitation for tribes to become involved with us in new and different ways than we have in the past. And then the fifth theme is how should we evaluate success? How will we know if what we're doing is working? In addition to that, there's 4 specific sets of questions that we're asking. The first one is how do we incorporate both indigenous knowledge and Western science? And the first part of that is how do we braid these things together? What do we know from indigenous knowledge? And how does that match up with what Western science tells us? And how doesn't it match up with what Western science tells us? And how can we learn from those things? The second is how do we operationalize adaptive management? So knowing whether what we're doing is working and changing the things that we're doing when we also have a rapidly changing climate to go with it. And then finally, under that, the science category is the climate risk viewer. So the Forest Service, with this AMPR, we've released a tool that you can use to combine various geospatial level layers, and think about what does this mean in a particular area in terms of changing climate. The second area of questions is on adaptation and planning practices. And again, we're looking at the ecological scales. So when we think about biomes or ecosystems or specific areas, watersheds, how should we think about them as we think about changing climate? And then in terms of planning, how should we do this in terms of our organization? What should we do at the national level? What should we do at the regional level, and so on? And then finally, in this area, what adaptation practices can we use to maintain and foster climate resiliency? And particularly since the Forest Service is a multiple use agency, how do we do that? And also in the context of our mandate to have multiple uses. The third area is particularly interesting to me because, as Josh mentioned, this is the area that I'm leading for the Forest Service, which is about mature and old growth. So we have 2 questions there. The first one is how can we sustainably manage for mature and old growth given changing climate conditions? And then the second one is how can we manage to increase the amount of mature and old growth forests, and how can we spread them across the landscape in ways that make them redundant and sustainable over time, again, with the changing climate. And then the last area that we have is fostering social and economic climate resilience. One of the things we're very interested in is how can we identify the impacts to tribes, communities, and the national forest system that we're likely to see because of changing climate. And then how do we support underserved communities that are being faced with changes that they have to address due to the changing climate? We're interested in trying to understand how we can leverage state, tribal, and private programs so that we can work across boundaries. How can we help communities become more climate resilient? And then finally, how do we collaborate with tribes and communities as we do things across boundaries? So with that, I will turn it back to Josh.
All right, thanks, Jamie. So we just heard from the BLM and the Forest Service about 2 rulemakings that they have going on that will be kind of national in scope. Lastly, here with this question, we're going to turn it over to Christy, and she's going to be talking about answering the same question, but within the context of this Northwest Forest Plan that touches down in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, and kind of what it is and why it's important. So Christy, why don't you take it away?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to the conference committee too for continuing this virtual participation for both not only speakers, but participants. It's really welcomed. So thanks. So the Northwest Forest Plan, much of what's previously spoken, the Northwest Forest Plan, a little bit of background on that right now. It covers 24.5 million acres of federally managed lands in Western Oregon, Washington, and Northwestern California. A large component of those are 17 national forests, 7 BLM districts, 6 national parks, and then 1 national wildlife refuge, and a little bit of Department of Defense lands. And the cohort of what consists of this Northwest Forest Plan group is a large landscape approach to federal land management designed to protect threatened and endangered species, while also contributing to social and economic sustainability in the region. As of recently, the Northwest Forest Plan established a federal advisory committee, otherwise known as a FACA. The Federal Register for call for applicants went out in December and closed in January. We did receive a lot of applications. We were focusing on not only tribal members, but folks from the scientific community, also calling out specifically, hopefully getting an Indigenous knowledge individual to serve on this committee. The selections actually have been made, but right now they're getting approved and vetted through the Secretary of Agriculture. So those announcements should be coming out soon. And what the intent is, the establishment of that federal advisory committee is to build off the and modernize the Northwest Forest Plan. And they're gonna be the core group to build and put input into this new plan for the Northwest Forest Plan. But also in addition, tribes can still participate through their government to government with each forest to participate in also in the Northwest Forest Plan revisions. And what's huge about this too is not only that the Northwest Forest Plan itself will be modernized, but the other additional 17 national forests in that region, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, will look to this Northwest Forest Plan as a template to build and modernize their own each individual forest plans. So the opportunity there is huge. Again, also mentioned before, there's a huge movement within this administration to include Indigenous knowledge, tribal input, tribal participation. So a lot of the forests in Washington and Oregon are also trying to find unique and new ways to include tribal voices at the table. This Federal Advisory Committee for the Northwest Forest Plan is just one of many. There's also, I did want to mention a couple other things going on that impact Washington and Oregon specifically, and a little bit of the Region 10 and the Tongass National Forest and the Chugach National Forest. We have an effort called Reimagine Recreation that's also looking for tribal input. And other than that, I think that's it for me.
All right, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, I was just going to say I can include some links too for folks to learn more about the Northwest Forest Plan.
Okay, so we just kind of went through a question posed to each panelist about what is this initiative that each of the agencies is undertaking. So now I'm going to go through and ask each of the panelists a second question, which is about the tribal consultation and tribal engagement piece to each one of these initiatives. And so kind of going back in that same order, let's start with the BLM. And Dave, I might turn it over to you to talk about what the tribal consultation and tribal engagement piece is to the BLM's public lands rule.
Thanks, Josh. As tribal leadership knows across the country, the current administration is very concerned with both climate change adaptation, conservation, and tribal engagement, and that comes all the way down to BLM. Much like the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management started this upping the game about 6 years ago.
Dave, real quick, not to interrupt you. I don't know if your camera is off on your end, but we can't see you right now for whatever that's worth.
Interesting. I can see myself.
There we go. We got you.
Okay, sorry. So that started with our 1780 manual and handbook, which directs all BLM staff all the way down the line to engage with tribes in their respective fields. And I did put a link into our tribal consultation website, and that manual and handbook is available linked to that site. For the current and any decisions and policymaking that the Bureau does, we are to engage with tribes, and we have outreach to tribes, both from headquarters and from the respective state offices. Obviously, typically tribal leadership wants to talk directly with the decision makers. And so in this particular case for the public lands rule, that would be at the headquarters level, facilitated through the states. And we're happy to do that. Donna and I are the points of contacts for our region to do that kind of stuff. As far as co-stewardship, that's another major part of both the public lands rule and the administration's goals here, as reminded to us by Secretary Holland yesterday here at the National Congress of American Indians. We do have new guidance both from the department in Joint Secretarial Order 3403, and a link to that is in the chat, as well as the PMI, the Permanent Instruction Memorandum for BLM, which is also linked in the chat, which directs each state to develop a plan for co-stewardship and outreach to tribes. And each of our states, the 12 states, have just recently done that. And so I would encourage folks to ask about that. Each state has its own specific state director's plan on how to engage with tribes in co-stewardship. I believe that Oregon, Washington is top of the pile on having done the outreach and developed a really robust plan. So Northwest region, give us a call.
Donna, would you like to add anything?
I think just in regards to the land rule and our director Stone Manning, I think is really just prioritizing how to elevate conservation on an equal footing with other uses and to guide responsible development while safeguarding important places for the millions of people that visit public lands. I know that seems a little more relevant perhaps in the lower 48, but up here in Alaska, we do obviously rely heavily on the FLIPMA measure, which is, the multiple use provision. And so I think what's exciting through the filtration of tribal sentiments is really along ensuring resilient landscapes and, watersheds or corridors that are meaningful to, people relying on, subsistence uses. And there are things that I think overlap with climate resilience that very much have to do with food security measures that people are really concerned about, particularly on the Yukon and the Kuskokwim River corridors. And I've spent a lot of time speaking with our lead fisheries biologist, Matt Varner here in Alaska, who oversees a lot of the assessment, inventory, monitoring of, valuable watersheds. I think what folks for Alaska can get excited about in terms of the co-stewardship opportunities has to do with the Department of the Interior's advancement of the Gravel to Gravel initiative as part of a restoration and resilience framework that helps guide $2 billion in investments as part of the Biden bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, where 5 of the 16 million is set aside for grants with tribal partner voices in mind and Indigenous knowledge and local expertise to place that into the planning and decision-making process. So I think the bottom line that touches perhaps a lot of folks in the room or attending this session really stems down to the NEPA process and what what opportunities and what capacity also do tribes or tribal organizations and even some of our ANCSA entities have to really elevate support within that resilience framework for those conservation measures. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Donna. All right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. You kind of touched on your answer, but the kind of the tribal consultation and engagement piece to the Forest Service's climate resilience role.
And I can add a little bit more. So there's a few things. I did mention that we have a tribal consultation that's about to open for the advance notice of proposed regulation for the climate informed forest policy. And that will open, like I said, on the 13th with the tribal forum on the 12th of January or 12th of July. I'll get that date right one of these times. But I'd like to mention a couple of other things that we're doing. So one of the things that we're doing that we feel is kind of innovative is our Office of Tribal Relations has just published a tribal action plan that outlines how we will interact with tribes in pretty much all of the programs that the Forest Service has. And we also, with the mature and old growth work under Executive Order 14072, we started a new way of doing consultation, and basically that it's an open-ended consultation. So rather than having just 120 days or a 90-day consultation period for these big efforts, we're having consultation periods that will last indefinitely as long as we're working on that particular effort. So any tribe can come to us and say that it's time that they would like to consult on any aspect of what it is that we're doing. And then the final thing that I'd like to mention is with our mature and old growth work, we have a very extensive effort underway that it's a partnership with a group of foundations to look at how we can braid together Western science and indigenous knowledge. And the person that's heading this up is Christina Eisenberg, who's the Associate Dean for Inclusivity at Oregon State University, along with Susan Pritchard, who's a well-known fire scientist at the University of Washington. And we think that these kind of efforts are really important, and we'd like to try to understand whether they work, and if they do work, we would like to do a lot more of them.
All right, perfect, Jamie. And then Christy, over to you about the Northwest Forest Plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned there's participation and seats available that are on the Federal Advisory Committee, and that is not a substitute for government to government responsibilities. So there's that also a way to engage. Jamie mentioned the newly released Tribal Action Plan from the Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations. Their motto for this administration is early and often. So you'll hear these early consultation starts early in the form of these forums, like Jamie mentioned and you can also find those on the website. They list those on their website, and I'm going to post that to the chat here shortly. And in addition to one individual forest, like I said, once the Northwest Forest Plan revision is underway, it is going to be looked to as a template for other forests. So engaging with your local forest supervisors is also a way to have input.
All right, thank you, Christy. So at that point, those were kind of the two questions that I proposed to pose to each of the panelists here. Again, what is the initiative? Why is it important? And then what is the tribal engagement, tribal consultation component to each one of those? And so at this point, I don't know if anybody has any questions, but if folks have questions for the panelists, now's a good time. Randy.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm one of the organizers of this event, and I'm really excited to have all of these different agencies together talking about this. It's one of the things that our particular committee has heard over and over. And just for those of you who don't know who I am, I work for the Region 10 Tribal Operations Committee Consortium, who's hosting this event, and the committee as their executive director. And so we have town halls, we have these forums that we're hosting. We have a lot of outreach that we do with our tribes. And we also are hearing from our tribes so often that this is such an exciting time in history with this Biden administration and allocating so much attention to the environment and to tribes, and they're just very overwhelmed. And I know that's no news story for you guys. So I guess one question I had, seeing you all here together, and I know Andrew here, Baca is also here from Region 10 EPA, and he's heard this before too. What is being done potentially with the communication between interagency federal agencies to reduce the burden that tribes are getting right now? They can't possibly respond to most of these requests for consultation and comment. They are already tapped out. They would probably love to sit on a committee, but they're already sitting on 14 others, maybe. So just, putting that awareness out there, I wanted to hear kind of your response to that. And then before I let you respond, I'd like for you all to please, as Christy mentioned, post in the chat links to all of these opportunities so we can get those shared out as well.
Donna, I know you have thoughts on that because you and I talked about it leading up to this discussion, but I don't know if there's any of the other panelists, but feel free to take it away if you'd like, Donna.
Well, I guess in the lens of being an Indigenous person myself, I think part of, the consult early, consult often is really just about, within consultations, really getting on the same page or identifying what's happening even among our large federal agency presence here in Alaska, just given the fact that we have 229 federally recognized tribes, we have 174 INCSA village corporations, we have 12 regional corporations, we have 12 regional non-BIA service nonprofits that often leverage, DOI funding to uphold their natural resources or their IGAP programs, for example. It is a lot. And oftentimes when, consulting with different audiences is just starting with, what do you care about? Start with the top three. Also assuring my colleagues, even within the agency, to say, when you send out these mandatory Dear Tribal Leader letters, like don't have your feelings hurt if you don't get a response. But take the initiative to even just do cold calling or identifying additional partners that may be supporting tribal entities on policy initiatives may often go a lot further by just sparking the conversation. So going into consultation or opportunities, it's like, how do we almost take off our agency hat and put on our personality hat, if you will, to say, these are the things that I'm working on within the agency that, may be of use to your tribes or your tribal leadership, and start there with the conversation. And usually that can, wind down to a lot of different things, whether it's contaminated lands, quality of water, eroding coastlines, development projects on oil and gas, maybe mineral site concerns for ecosystem habitats. The conversation can go from there, and I think it can also result in a more fruitful and meaningful conversation, absorbing the sentiments of the people living on the land. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I have a couple of things. This is a great question that you asked, because it's something that we are very concerned with, is overwhelming tribes with asking them to talk about this, talk about that, talk about something else. And so there's two things I'd like to mention. And again, this open-ended consultation and an example about how that's working. Just today, I was responding to a letter from the Great Lakes Indian Fisheries and Wildlife Committee that was on an issue that we raised back in April of 2022. They responded to us. They responded at the time, but then they thought about it and they said, well, we'd like to talk some more about this. And so they sent us a really good letter that was about their thoughts on this and how they thought that we should interact. And it was a year after the fact, but it was really valuable. And it came in at a time it's opportunistically when we could really use it. And so I think that that helps a little bit, like stretching out the time and letting people do it. And another thing that I can't imagine how I forgot to mention is another issue another project that we have with Dr. Christina Eisenberg, who is a tribal or is a Native American. She's from Mexico. Is we're having for the mature and old growth work, we're going to have a set of tribal roundtables that are a preparation for consultation. And these will be meetings of tribes or tribal members only, that they can talk among themselves about what's important about mature and old growth forests, how should we manage them, and what values do we get from them? And that'll prepare them for consultation so that they can really think about how do they want to consult? Do they want to do it as groups? Do they want to do it as individual tribes? How do they want to go about doing this? And do they want to have some kind of consensus with what they do? So that's another thing that we're hoping is innovative, that we're trying out with this effort that we have going on.
Okay, thank you. Any of the other panelists have anything that they'd like to offer on that question?
So
I
I would
would
just mention
just
that I agree
say
with, go ahead, Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Gordon, I didn't quite catch what you said.
I said Dave to go ahead. I think that he was going to comment.
Oh, I
think
see. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Gordon. No, I think this is a really challenging issue. We have heard for years that, the feds have so many different programs going on that tribal folks just can't keep up. In fact, I heard a recent stat that each tribal leader, at least in the Northwest region, gets 20 to 50 Dear Tribal Leader letters daily. Obviously, they can't respond to half of those. But when we were directed to come up with co-stewardship plans late last year, I sit on a team of tribal liaisons here in the Columbia Basin, and we talked about how we should be consulting with the tribes as a consortium of agencies, but really that needs to come from the top. And we don't have that kind of authority or power to convene all the agency decision makers and bring them together to discuss common issues with tribes, which I think is really important for a common understanding of where we're going, given the overall direction that the administration is pushing agencies towards, which I think is a very welcome thing across the board. I would say I neglected to mention with the ACEC part of the public lands rule, I think that's a great opportunity, as Donna mentioned, food sovereignty, for tribes to have input on managing lands that promote their first foods to their benefit and the conservation thereof.
Thank you, Dave. We do have a comment here in person here in the audience, but Gordon, I didn't know if you had anything to add.
No, I think that's great. I mean, comments have been have already been addressing how overwhelming this is, and so we agree it is a problem, and we'd like to figure out how to solve it. But yes, it's a problem.
All right, thanks, Gordon. Randy.
Thank you all for sharing that. And I'm really excited to hear about that. The roundtable for prepping for comments is a great idea. And we have never thought of that. So maybe we'll steal that idea too with our Region 10 Operations Committee and with some of our tribes, because as somebody else mentioned, we do have the responsibility to reach out to 272 tribes in our region. So that's a lot of work. My final thought on this is, think outside the box. Let's communicate with your other federal partners. Let's see if you guys can potentially find ways to communicate before these things go out. If there's overlapping jurisdictions, if there's overlapping, responsibilities, if the buck gets passed from one agency to the next at certain stages in your projects, please try to communicate before you even initiate the consultation, because maybe you could combine forces and reduce that burden to the tribes. And my final thought really is that we hear over and over from the tribes that we represent is because they can't get to all of these responses and requests for consultation, and you don't hear from it. And sometimes it's like, okay, well, I know they're busy. We didn't hear from them, but it's very, very important that the agencies realize that no comment doesn't mean no interest or no, that they don't care. And oftentimes what happens is that federal agencies will check the box. Oh, we initiated consultation. We put this out there. We didn't get any responses. We're going to move forward. So that's the problem. I think the really deep rooted problem here is that the opportunities are wonderful, but the opportunity to respond correctly and appropriately is not there, and it cannot be taken for silence's approval. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Randy. Other questions or comments from the audience? Yeah.
First, this is Andrew Baca with EPA, EPA Region 10 in Seattle. First, a big thank you to the panel. I think one of the benefits of conferences like this is we get a chance to interact with folks that are obviously doing very similar work, incredibly important work, and work that probably doesn't cross within my viewpoint on a regular basis. But the question I have for the panel is, do you have any recommendations for your federal partners on areas where we should be collaborating a bit more? I'm incredibly excited about taking a look at the model of an open-ended consultation. I think one of the things that we grapple with almost all the time is timelines, and really making sure that we hear from everyone who has interest, and you seem to have created flexibility that I don't think we currently allow. But I would welcome thoughts on other areas, because certainly I think you guys have run down a list that are of interest not only to tribes in EPA Region 10, but also the programs that I work with on a daily basis. So thank you guys very much.
Yeah, do any of the panelists there have anything to add on to what Andrew just offered?
I guess I have just kind of a comment too, not so much a response, but some innovative things I think that have been going on and maybe kind of fell by the wayside due to the pandemic. I know in Alaska, when I was in Alaska, we had what was called the Alaska Tribal Interagency Tribal Liaison Group that met at least quarterly, and we all, from all the agencies, EPA, BLM, Forest Service, NRCS, and we even at one point had state of Alaska tribal liaisons come, and we convened and we just did just that. It's like, hey, this is what's going on in our agency. We're going to be out in Kotzebue or wherever. So I think there's opportunity for up in Alaska to reinvigorate that. But now that I'm down in Washington and Oregon, I think something, and I've talked about it with a few fellow tribal liaisons in order to do just that, because I do sit on a couple smaller, I guess, tribal liaison groups with respects to Columbia River fisheries. We have a federal tribal caucus of liaisons there. But I think that's something probably we can do better for sure. And I try to stay in touch with my fellow tribal liaisons in Washington and Oregon too, whatever agency. But that's just kind of just a comment. Thanks.
I would follow that up, Christy, with when I started with BLM many years ago in Northwest California, we had what we called the Strategic Partnership Coalition, and I've mentioned this nationally before, wherein both agency leadership from federal and state agencies, as well as tribal leadership, met quarterly to discuss issues of common concern, not issues of project implementation or consultation, but it gave us an opportunity to know each other, to know where folks stood, and to be able to pick up the phone and call folks when there was an issue that we needed to discuss more in depth. That, I think, in the idea of getting all the tribal liaisons together is one thing, but if I know that some tribes, at least in the Northwest, have intergovernmental liaisons that we can reach out to directly, but if we had a regular meeting of tribes and tribal liaisons and or managers where we just got to know each other and know what's going on and discuss that, we would get a lot farther. When we had the national calls a few years ago with tribal leadership across the country, one of the big things that they said was, you would never send a representative from the federal government to another country not knowing who they are and what their positions are, what their interests are. And we do that for tribes all the time. We don't know our tribes, and for good reason, we don't go out and talk with them.
I think I'd just like to add a comment that I'm in routine communication with the tribal liaison, similar to what Christy mentioned, from the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So Maya Lukeen and Crystal Leonetti. But I do think that, the opportunity to grow is great. There's a lot of competing priorities happening just with Alaska Native tribes and tribal organizations with the infrastructure law and the Reduction Act, and pools and pools of funding that folks are eligible for. And so I think there is opportunity to synergize and recreate those, not only the roundtables, but I think also in the spirit of co-stewardship, tribes wanting or having intent to comment or be involved in, EISs or, public comment periods, having those forums routinely, I think are great opportunities, because Alaska, even though we're so big, we're actually really small too. So we have to sort of remember that in the back of our heads when conversing or engaging with the public. Thank you.
I don't know if that was me. Sounds like the ceiling's falling in. Okay, well, I just want to thank all of the panelists. We're at time. We're actually 10 minutes past time, and I think this field trip starts at 4:30, so we may have to kind of close it up here. But here's the deal. I just want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank all of you for joining and the questions. I want to thank the IT staff, you guys, for handling in-person, virtual slideshows. I think we kind of test the limits here with this one, so thanks so much. And then just emphasizing once again, these are important initiatives, but the tribes just have a lot going on, so just want to recognize that too. So I think with that, the slide deck, we didn't show, there's a slide that has everybody's contact information who served on the panel. So when you guys are done with the conference, if there's anything that you heard today where you'd like to follow up, there's email addresses for all the panelists. So thanks so much again.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all.